I didn't at that time want to stay in academia. I loved science, but inherently inside me was perhaps more of an engineer. Part of bias is simply that it's a very small subset of questions for which there is one exactly correct answer. You actually missed my biggest ever pivot when Datacom opened up a general management role in Malaysia. And with
Yes.
3 children under 6 at the time, I said, yes, I'd like to do that. So that's where I see the massive opportunity for the application of AI in a way that will raise all boats. I notice when people say that the job will be replaced by a robot, it is almost always not their job that they're talking about. The people are what matters, right? I agree with you that there are certain things that I don't think our society would be improved by having completely automated.
Yes.
But
today we're thrilled to have a wonderful female leader joining us, Kendra Vant. Kendra is a visionary in the world of artificial intelligence and data with a decade of experience of leading teams. Her career is marked by a passion for building, from products and teams to entire companies, and turning innovative ideas into realities. Kendra has worked for a lot of big name organisations such as Datacom, Westpac, Deloitte, Telstra, Seek, Xero, and recently the National AI Centre. With a practical and commercial mindset, Kendra excels in creating and implementing strategies that not only meet but exceed the hyperinflated expectation of today's tech landscape. In today's show, Kendra unpacks the importance of working with smart people to solve tough problems, as well as the role of human intuition in artificial intelligence.
Kendra, thank you for joining me today. From my research about your story, I discovered a clear passion for applying your experience around data and AI to solve some pretty challenging and difficult problems. I also discovered what I describe as a pretty unorthodox entry into the world of technology. So I'm really fascinated to learn about your story today and kind of discover the journey and kind of how it played out for you. So I guess we'll begin at the beginning. And from your LinkedIn profile, I could see that you've lived and you've studied and you've kind of travelled all over the place. So where are you originally from? Where was home?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. Start at the beginning, I'm a Kiwi, so most people will hear that in my voice. It's a bit muddled up now after many years overseas, but actually the first thing I ever remember wanting to do was to be a novelist. So
wow.
Goodness, I'm a long way off track.
You are, that's right. There's still time.
Yes, there you go.
Right, okay, so what inspired that? What made you, a young Kendra, dream of?
What makes 6-year-olds dream of anything? I'm really not sure. I think it was that I loved telling stories.
Yep.
And I remember just being lucky to have a really rich neighbourhood of kids, and we spent a lot of time outside, highly imaginative, like figuring out this and building pirate ships, and I think it was turning those stories that we'd worked on together into novels. So there you go. Apparently 6-year-old Kendra was dead sure she wanted to be a novelist. Yeah.
So you pivoted pretty quick from that because you then went to University of Auckland where you studied physics, which from what I read led on to a master's and then a PhD at MIT. And then on to Los Alamos, so all in physics. So what kind of motivated or what steered you towards physics at that point in your life?
Yeah, so as well as wanting to be a novelist and a chef, the first ever public photo of me that sort of got into the newspapers was me as a little girl with my cuddly rabbit peering down a microscope at the equivalent of New Zealand's CSIRO Open Day. So physics and science was just in the blood from really early on. And I think that for me, it is all about wanting to know the answer. It is, I want to know what makes that work. I want to know how we do this. I want to know how we do that. My father's also a physicist, so that may have something to do with it. But I just loved everything to do with science and math. And Auckland University was a fabulous place to study that. So I never considered studying anything but science, to be honest. That makes me a science geek from way back, I guess. And I just really enjoyed it. I was thrilled to be able to spend time diving deep into that. I worked for, when I was doing my master's at Auckland, I worked for an American who said, you should definitely apply to US universities, which was an amazing thing for him to say because it's probably not something that would have occurred to me otherwise. And I'm good at taking a bit of a nudge from people. Like, oh, okay, I'll do it. So I did. I applied to a whole bunch of American universities. Chose MIT actually because they weren't going to make me go back into the classroom.
Okay.
So, Americans tend to spend a couple of years of their doctorate in classwork again. And I had a fabulous time in the lab for a year doing my master's degree. So I genuinely, that was one of the big reasons I chose MIT was, I can go straight back into the lab. Excellent, I'm going there.
I mean, it's been pretty impressive to go from University of Auckland to MIT. You know, it's a major university on a global scale. I don't know where it ranks in terms of physics, but it must be pretty high. And then, as I mentioned, onto Los Alamos, which most people would probably now know because of Oppenheimer. I mean, someone's given you a nudge, but there's still obviously something else going on there that's enabled you to make those moves.
Yeah, I don't think I thought about this back when I was in my, what was I, 20 when I made the jump to the US.
Yeah.
But for me now, it's very much, I don't want to die wondering. So I'm always prepared to take a risk, make a move, because I want to know what that will be.
Yeah.
So if I'm left with two alternatives, this one, kind of see where I'll be if I do that. I can map out the next 5 years. And the other one's like, I'm actually much more likely to take. And I've used that decision-making technique, specifically that one. I can think of 3 specific times when I'm like, I know what that would be. I don't know what that would be. Don't want to die wondering. I'm going to go with that one. And it hasn't let me down so far.
Yeah, I love it. So a life of no regrets.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe I've just been blessed to be in a situation where nothing really truly catastrophic has happened.
Yeah.
But also for me, I'm not suggesting that every decision I made has been, in hindsight, the perfect one.
Yeah.
But you can learn from anything you do.
Yes.
And learning from, wow, that was really hard. I mean, I'm sure that there are things that I will not do based on that learning. It's all learning. So I think for me, yes, I would say so far, touch wood, with a great deal of grace. Yeah. I have no regrets. Yeah.
And how did you make that transition from Auckland to the US? I imagine culturally it's very different.
I got on a plane with 2 suitcases, and I don't say that sarcastically. It really was quite strange.
Yeah.
It was putting all your life so far into 2 suitcases, knowing exactly what the luggage limit was on United Airlines, I think it was. Good grief. And turning up on the other side of the world. Getting into the airport in Boston and being picked up by my first example of an evangelist taxi driver who wanted to know if I had found God, which is a very confronting thing to be asked when you've been awake for 27 hours and you can barely understand this gentleman's accent. The US is a really big cultural difference to Australia and New Zealand, and I know people laugh when you say that, but it's certainly something at Xero I really noticed, is that we had a really diverse leadership team. And I sometimes would end up acting as the translator. I'm a Kiwi by birth, an Australian by the last 12 years, and have spent a bunch of time in the US. So I would get people coming to me and saying, I don't understand. When New Zealanders say this, what do they mean? Or, I don't understand. Why are you Aussies like this? It was an interesting additional job that I had when I was at Xero. Yeah.
It's interesting because, again, what I'm kind of hearing there is that you've become a bit of a global citizen, in the sense that the ability to hear and understand and translate because of those experiences.
I think across that very limited slice of humanity, which, let's be honest, New Zealand, Australia and America is not exactly a global citizenship.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, I am more strongly attached to experiences and opportunities than I am to a particular country. I'm very proud to be a Kiwi. I'm now also a very happy Aussie. But it's interesting because all 3 of my children do describe themselves as global citizens. If you actually ask them where they're from, they will tell you they are global citizens.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think it's a good mindset for us to have, because it means that we're more likely to see whole pictures and less likely to become really partisan.
Yeah. I think the other learning there is that there's an assumption that Australia, New Zealand and the UK and the US, they're all kind of informed by the same kind of cultural drivers, but they're not. They are all subtly different.
They're subtly different, or not so subtly, yes.
Well, yeah, that's right. But it's the subtle differences that can make teams work when you talk about from a leadership perspective. And it's actually great to hear that people were looking to you and saying, can you help me translate this?
I think in a workplace you really notice it, and certainly also in the hiring market you really notice it, because the way that Australians and New Zealanders who have worked predominantly here will present themselves, both in their resumes and in their conversational style during an interview, is quite different from the way that somebody who has lived and worked almost exclusively in the US will present themselves. And I think having a view of that allows you to make sure you really are comparing apples with apples, rather than getting caught with that cultural stereotype of how people speak about themselves. Yeah,
that's right. I feel like I could be this guy's publicist, but there's a Dr. Fons Trompenaar from Belgium, and he specifically focuses on looking at cultural diversity in business. And he goes around the world and he asks people from different countries, and he gives them dilemmas and asks basically, how would you work through this dilemma? And then looks at the comparisons, but uses that to shine the light on neither of you are right or wrong. You're both looking at the dilemma from a different lens because of where you've been brought up. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend Von Strompener. It's also a great name. How can you not look at someone's work when they're called that? So we go back to the story. So following your work at Los Alamos, you then suddenly find yourself, according to your LinkedIn, at Datacom, where I think you spent 3.5 years. And what I just read in the description is it says progressing through the ranks from BA to general management. And I thought that's an enormous leap from physics and everything that involves to suddenly you're a BA. So how did you make that transition?
It was an enormous leap. So I spent much of my time in the US having many people ask me if I was in the green card lottery. And my answer was always, no, I come from a really lovely country on the other side of the world, which I have every intention of returning to. So staying in the US was never on my plan.
Yep.
I loved my time there. It was a fantastic experience, but I wanted to come home. I wanted to raise family with family. I had 3 children when I was in grad school. And so I had 3 under 3 when I finished my postdoc at Los Alamos. And heading home to have the support of family to raise those children around the family was really important for me.
Yeah, okay.
So that was the motivating force, shall we say. The mission was I want to move back to New Zealand. I didn't at that time want to stay in academia. It's partly because the specialty I worked in was very expensive.
Right.
And so the daunting prospect of getting research grants of the size that would have allowed me to continue in that research area in New Zealand was really daunting. It would have been quite hard. So I really specifically had an intention to move out of academia. I also probably at that time realised that I loved science, but inherently inside me was perhaps more of an engineer, which was, I was not interested in pursuing the next piece of theory.
Yeah.
I was interested in building things and making practical changes to the world. So I fully intended to step away from the academic world. I actually went through a huge crisis of confidence. And I say that because I think it's really important that people, particularly younger in their career, realise you grow into feeling confident and like looking as though your career was all like mapped out, but often it wasn't.
Yep.
And I went through a huge crisis of confidence because I didn't understand at that age and that stage how to identify my transferable skills. So I knew a lot about being a research scientist, but it wasn't easy for me to articulate how they would translate into another career. Yes. Now it's easy. The persistence to be able to work on board problems, the ability to break down ambiguous things into chunkable pieces of work. It's really easy and obvious to see and to talk about how those skills transferred. But at that stage, it wasn't.
Who helped you with that?
I think I'll just have to shout out to the CEO of Datacom at the time. I literally, through a random walk, drifted across the path, of a recruiter who was effectively on permanent retainer from Datacom. So he was not affiliated with the company, but he knew them well, and he was simply told, like, JT, go out there, and if you find interesting people, bring them to us first.
Yeah, great.
And that is what happened. I walked into an interview with the then and now, I believe, CEO of Datacom. And he said to me as I was walking around, right, we want to hire you. We're not sure what the job will be yet, but, you've got a job.
Yeah.
I bring it up because I think it's an extraordinary, and if you can do it, and Datacom is a strong company. It's the biggest exporter of technology in New Zealand. It's a really substantial company in New Zealand. One challenge with only having open roles for really specific roles is that you miss people who don't quite fit the cookie cutter that you have. And I think it was a real strength of Datacom to be like, yep, sure, we hire software engineers, we hire architects, we hire the things we know we need, but we're big enough that we're also going to have a roving eye out there saying, let's hire some people who don't quite fit our model. So looking back, I realised that they simply said, no idea what we're going to do with this woman, but I'm sure she could be interesting and we can always get rid of her if she's not. And they took a chance.
How did you feel going into a role with that degree of ambiguity?
That's a really interesting question. It did not bother me at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that is the scientist in me and the person who had at that time navigated through the extraordinary pressure cooker of MIT, because it is.
Yes.
It's an amazing place to spend time, but boy, it hardens you up. The suicide rates in the undergraduates and graduates at MIT are actually quite high, which is a really shocking statistic, but it's true because it's an absolute crucible. Yeah. And going from there and going through the experience of moving states, ambiguity did not bother me. Yeah. And I was absolutely blessed to fall into a team of extremely generous people who were curious and motivated by learning and building, and they welcomed me with open arms. And what I really look back at Datacom and I'm extremely thankful for is I never had any kind of resentment for who are you and what are you doing here and why are you attempting to transition into a career that you have no training for. People were like, great, you're here. We need people who are smart and can do work. Get to it.
That's interesting because that the ability to assimilate people in that situation. I think there's a lot of companies out there that we encounter or I encounter that have got the ambition to do that, but haven't necessarily set up the environment to be successful. But it sounds like that was, well, actually from the top, the CEO all the way down was culturally building the ability to embrace diversity and people from different walks of life that have got the talent and probably hidden potential.
And I think also to open yourself up to the opportunity to change from within, which is incredibly important for large companies, right? Yeah. Because otherwise you do tend to turn around and go, whoops, I didn't see my Kodak moment coming. So,
yeah, that's interesting. Also through that time, it's through your description, you moved into a general management type role. Did leadership come naturally to you?
So I'd been at Datacom a couple of years working mostly as a BA, which is a fantastic job, by the way. So much fun. Datacom had the concept of business units and business unit management, which means you had full P&L control of a group of people. And I was tapped on the shoulder and asked if I would like to step into a business unit management role. Honestly, again, because they had a gap, they looked around and went, you can have a go. It was a really interesting and challenging transition because I went from maybe 2 years of experience working commercially to leading a group of people, most of whom had more experience than I did.
Yeah.
Did leadership come naturally? It was the next challenge, I think, is the thing I would say, and I wanted to do it well. So as with all of the things where I've made pivots or changes in my life, I just dived into learning about how to do it. And I had some really good mentors. Yeah. I had some extraordinary support from within my own team who were basically like happy to allow me to do the things that they didn't find interesting. And that perhaps is one of the great things about leading software engineers. If you're actually a relatively good leader, you tend to get a lot of support from your team because most software engineers have little interest in a lot of the boring parts of management and leadership.
Yeah.
So relatively naturally, I would say, but also I put an enormous amount of effort into gathering feedback, learning what I wasn't doing well, and boy, I can remember those things, and building my skill set.
Yeah, okay. We're going to come back to the feedback. I think I'm interested in, I don't believe selecting leaders is a lottery. There must have been something that somebody saw in you. What do you think they saw in you as a trait?
I would suspect at that point in time it was the ability to morph into things when they were needed. Okay. So to notice that there was a gap, to notice that there was a challenge with a client problem, or that there was an issue with a person not gelling into a space well, and rather than wait to be asked to fix that, naturally moving to fix that. That would be my guess. That's what I would have been looking for in my BAs when I was a business unit manager.
Yeah, great. You then took a kind of another pivot of sorts and you moved into the world of banking. And you spent some time with CBA and with Westpac. I was just interested what appealed to you about the banking sector.
You actually missed my biggest ever pivot when Datacom opened up a general management role in Malaysia. And with
Sorry, you're right. Yes.
3 children under 6 at the time, I said, yes, I'd like to do that. It was absolutely fabulous. We had a wonderful time. And then I gave them 2 recommendations, one of which was close the business unit down. And unfortunately for me, that's the one they chose.
All right. Okay.
So that was a baptism of fire.
Sorry, how long were you in? That was Kuala Lumpur?
Yeah, KL, 4 months.
4 months.
Yep, moved my entire family there and then moved them all back in.
Yeah, right. Okay. That takes a lot of courage to go out there, to move your family, and then your first recommendation is maybe consider closing this business unit.
That was one of those never die wondering moments. One of the ones I look back on. Yep, I knew that I had no idea what my life would look like if I chose that move, and I have never ever regretted doing it. Yeah, even though it was 4 months and done. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's probably better to do 4 months and done than 4 years dragging something out.
True.
because you've made the commitment and the decision, you're going to stubbornly kind of stick to it.
Yeah.
So sorry, I did miss that one. You're right. But I'm going to ask you about banking. So tell me about that. Tell me about what. Why banking?
This is going to sound dreadful because it is yet again an experience when I wasn't seeking it.
Yeah.
It was an opportunity that presented itself, and I said yes. So It was actually, again, a really thoughtful and broad-thinking recruitment professional who I was introduced to through a network I had in Sydney, and she was similarly like, you're an odd fish. I know exactly where to send you. And again, just introduced me to somebody who was seeking for something he couldn't find, and he decided to take a chance. That's how I made it into banking. The reason I stayed in banking for so long is it's an absolutely fascinating place to work with data.
Yes.
And it's also a place where people realised quite early on in this arc of using machine learning and AI within business that it was a place where that was sensible to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know what was interesting when I was looking at the timeframes? I was thinking 2010s. There's a lot happening in data at that point, and the banks were probably one of the first to.
Absolutely.
Banks and retail, big retail, were the first to really embrace the value or the learnings from that data side. Actually, a few weeks back, we had Darren Klein on actually speaking about banking and data and exactly very similar thing, and probably the challenges and the opportunities and the problems. And interestingly, you followed a similar path to Darren, I noticed, because he also went out and set up his own data consulting business that I spotted that something I believe you did yourself. Data science, I think was the name of the business. So I was interested if founding your own business was another thing that was on your kind of career bucket list.
No, I have to hand that one to my husband. I also have to hand the naming of the business to him, which was quite amazing, because now you look back at it and go, it's an odd thing to call your business, it's the name of a job. But actually back then it wasn't.
Yes.
That was actually before the rise of data science as a role. I have considered owning my own business. Working at Xero is an amazing place to get a taste of that without making the plunge, if you might say. I'll never say never, because careers are long and jobs are short. But at the moment for me, I really enjoy team-based work. I really enjoy working with incredibly smart people to work on hard problems. I haven't yet had the itch to solve the problem and therefore want to found a company around it, but perhaps it will happen in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, okay. So sorry, maybe I misunderstood. So data science wasn't your business?
It was, but it was a bridging situation for us as we yet again moved from country to country.
Yeah, right, got it, okay. And I was interested in, having gone through that experience, if you were advising someone that was considering maybe going out on their own, what kind of advice would you give based on what you went through?
It would be less to do with that experience and more to do with the experience I gained in the 4 years at Xero, working with an enormous number of small business owners.
Yeah.
It would be, there is nothing more all-encompassing than running your own business.
Yeah.
So don't do it for money. Don't do it. Maybe the main one will be don't do it for money.
Yeah.
And be really thoughtful about the techniques you'll use to make sure that you don't sell your entire life to your business. I think that's a really tricky one, to learn how to put enough of a gap between you as your small business owner and you as your family member, friend, partner, parent, child. I've seen a few people have the challenge of not being able to make that distinction. And I think that that's my counsel to anyone who's thinking of going into small business. If you are truly passionate about something, you should give it a go. But you should build a support network around you to make sure that you spend your time on your passion and not your books. So my Xero experience coming through there. But also that you have a way of making sure that it doesn't become in an overwhelming way your entire life.
Yeah, and that's easy done. I also think your first piece of advice there was interesting about don't do it just for the money. It's something I think we talk about within our business, and I've heard in other businesses that running a business and making money is just a truism. As in, if you don't make money, you're not in business and you can't survive. So that shouldn't be your purpose. Otherwise, it's a very short-term ambition. There has to be some other kind of purpose behind that, I think. But you're right, there has to be boundaries, because if you're not careful, suddenly it's 24/7 and you're never off. And the sacrifices you make, probably for the upsides of the flexibility and everything else that comes with it, are just not worth it. I saw that you also joined Deloitte around that time, and I was curious. So it's interesting. So you've just kind of been in these different industries and different experiences, and that's obviously in the world of consulting. So I was just curious about why Deloitte, and what about that role appealed to you?
Yeah, so you're picking apart the fact that I don't have a traditional career, which is absolutely true. The through line of my career is always solving hard problems with smart people. Again, a country move.
Okay.
We moved very consciously to Australia and very consciously to Melbourne. It's hard to pick up mid-career in a country that you have just moved to, as you're probably familiar with yourself. Yeah. I'm again forever grateful to Deloitte to being the company that said, oh yes, we will hire someone who has no Australian companies on her CV.
Yeah.
Consulting is an amazing thing to do, particularly early on in your career, because it gives you the opportunity to see many different industries and to work with many different companies. So I loved my time at Deloitte. Again, I was extremely lucky to fall in with a group of just lovely human beings, most of whom I'm still in touch with today, many of whom I've hired actually in other companies over the years. And what really attracted me to the team that we were in and the work that we're in was that it was quite cutting edge. So it was quite actually taking techniques that were relatively new to market and applying them. And it was very outcome based. So it was all around making commercial outcomes for our customers, most of whom were banks. There was another time where I spent a lot of time in banking. And that opportunity to learn quickly, implement quickly, and then potentially move to something completely different, tear down all that knowledge and start again. Loved it.
Yeah, it's great. I think I read through your description of that role that you were shaping a new practice in data for Deloitte. So was that a new product or a new service that they hadn't had previously in the region?
It was right at the time when companies were starting to really understand that you could actually build software products with machine learning incorporated inside them. So perhaps in the few years before that, a lot of the work that the consulting firms around Australia delivered with data tended to more be build it in a notebook, build it in an Excel spreadsheet, deliver it in a PowerPoint and hand it back as a business outcome to a person, somebody in strategy. And what was really emerging was an actual fact that Australia was picking up where the US had probably been 5 to 10 years earlier, that what you really wanted to do to build sustainable business value was to thread data through your product set and actually build software that was enabled by machine learning. That's a quite distinctly different skill set, and that's what we were looking to shape.
Yeah, great. Okay. So in what ways did that role push you outside your comfort zone?
I think the wonderful thing about consulting, that it was one reason why I really recommend folk in their 20s and 30s give it a go, is that you get a lot of exposure really quickly to senior executive. And you get a lot of, if you're good at it, you get a lot of opportunity to be a bit of an all-rounder. So if you're hired as if a consulting team is in a business, the client wants to know that they really do have technical expertise, but they want that technical expertise to be articulate. Yeah. So you get a lot of opportunity to go from the code to the boardroom and really have those conversations with fairly exacting people who are, used to asking questions and getting pithy answers. So it really just gives you that opportunity to step up and pitch.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it really kind of sharpens the message. It's probably what I'd kind of articulate or take away from that. I saw that you moved on after sort of 3 years Was that a case of job done and on to the next challenge?
I think I got tapped on the shoulder.
Yeah,
I've moved a lot by being tapped on the shoulder and saying, ooh, actually. And 3 years is probably a time when, for me, unless there's a new challenge to move on to in the same business, I'm really keen for a new challenge. So that's probably why at about the 3 to 4 year mark, you get those itchy feet, and it's either a big new possibility inside the same company or it's a different company.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I think there's a lot of debate, particularly on LinkedIn, around tenure of jobs and the significance or meaning behind it. But I think 3 years is enough time to kind of get in, understand a problem, do something meaningful with it, adjust, align it, and then either look for the next challenge or be that within the business or to move on. So I think it's a pretty good tenure.
And what I do is build. I build capabilities. So it's not impossible, of course, but it's perhaps a little less usual for an Australian company to have the need to build a capability for more than 3 years. At the 3 to 4 year mark, you tend to more be in this suits where we are right now.
Yeah.
We need to continue to run this as it is.
Yeah.
That's never been as attractive to me. So that's probably also why after 3 to 4 years, I have something that works well for the state of the business that it is in. And I'm super keen to be able to build the next capability.
Well, you certainly put that into action, because after that role with Deloitte, you moved on. I think you spent some time with Telstra, then with Seek, and then most recently with Xero. And from my kind of read of all of that was about building things. I think Telstra was around big data. It was incredibly prevalent and popular probably around that time, and lots of companies were kind of curious about that. What excited you about sort of big data and what companies were trying to do that? I'm quite interested.
Such a buzzword now, but yeah, back then it was of interest. And really, I think the best way still to explain what big data actually means is data where the size of the data becomes part of the problem, where the computation on top of that data is actually like, whoa, yeah, we're not going to be able to move that, and we're not going to be able to crunch that. For the listeners who are a little younger, you might not remember that in actual fact where big data sort of came from was some of the really large internet properties realizing that the processing they were doing on their 24 hours of data was going to soon take more than 24 hours to process.
You're right.
And so they're like, oh, we're really going to run into a wall here. We're going to need to come up with some new ways of working. So telcos are obviously amazing places to actually deal with an amount of data where the size of the data is part of the problem. There's not enormous numbers of companies in Australia in particular that really have that problem.
Yep.
Telcos absolutely do, because the volume and the sort of the velocity of network data is certainly up there when you have to think carefully about how you're going to store, move and compute with that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was definitely a buzzword at the time, and I felt like there was a lot of companies probably talking about big data, but you're right, they didn't have the volume to necessitate the need to invest in it. It just became a bit of a buzzword probably for investment, a bit like AI and cyber is such a prevalent term right now. And maybe a couple of years ago, it was blockchain and crypto was kind of dominating the tech headlines, so to speak. I saw that when you joined Seek, and I'm really interested in this around what you were building there around machine learning products. And I'm just interested in what challenges that presented you.
I had such a fabulous time at Seek. It is a wonderful, wonderful company. And I think I was really privileged to join it at a time when they had an amazing business and they were looking for an edge.
Yeah.
It's a particularly interesting business because, and it's one thing I actually actively seek out now, is businesses which don't have physical product.
Okay.
Because when you don't have a physical product, when you are a marketplace or a meeting place, you live and die on your ability to build value out of the data that flows through your platform. And that's been true at Seek, and it also was really true at Xero. So again, I was super, super fortunate when I went to Seek. We mentioned the buzzword of big data. Some years later, the buzzword was deep learning.
Yeah.
And Seek actually gave me a really practical space to apply for a commercially relevant reason all the new techniques that were arising in deep learning. So I was like a pig in mud.
Yeah.
Because we actually were able to, I built a small but really amazing team there. And we were literally reading the research papers and implementing the models to build some really impactful products, which really, really proud of. One of them actually was we we created a little badge that told you that you were a great candidate for this role.
Yeah.
And when we launched that into market, some of the feedback that I will never forget was from people who said, I wouldn't have applied for this job, but when I saw the top match badge, I had the confidence to do it.
Wow.
And not surprisingly, most of those people were from backgrounds that were not super traditional for the roles they were applying for. So women in particular, and folk who perhaps were not aligned with the typical profile of someone in that role. So that it's one of the sweet spots of my career, is remembering that we managed to launch a product that genuinely made a difference to people's confidence in taking the next steps in their own career.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like a virtual nudge.
Yeah.
As you described the nudge that you got to apply to MIT, you've kind of paid it forward, so to speak, with that creation. Look, I guess why I'm really interested in this is, and I'm potentially going to age myself by making this statement, but when I first came into recruitment, it was February 2000. And at that point, I'd never been on the internet. I'd never sent an email. I had a box of cards, and resumes came in the post. We put adverts in the newspaper, and we faxed resumes to clients. And so that was 2000. I would say the first job boards in the UK market probably came online 2003, 2004. Probably Facebook and so forth came on a few years later, and then LinkedIn, I reckon must have been 2010, something like that. But what was interesting, my job as a recruiter, and it's interesting, two of your experiences where you described a recruiter that knew the client, and you described yourself as an odd fish, which is actually a very backhanded compliment, by the way, but they knew to tap you on the shoulder because they knew what the client wanted. And I always used to, and I still believe, that the value proposition of a recruiter is the box of cards, and the clients that engage us. Who do you know? They're not looking for us necessarily to put an ad on Seek. They can do that themselves, or LinkedIn. But what was interesting is when the job boards came on, what I saw in the recruitment industry is every recruitment company's strategy became to build the biggest database. And everyone's harvesting all these profiles off of the job boards and off of LinkedIn and trying to put it into their own database to be quicker, faster, to get to that. And suddenly recruitment switched and it became sold on price and speed, as opposed to quality and depth of understanding. And this is a really long prelude to my question, by the way, but I talk to clients about it a lot now. There's 1.8 million people on LinkedIn in Melbourne. And I just say it's so much white noise. So much noise when you're trying to find the right person for the job, when that person's trying to find the right job for themselves. In many ways, technology, or the modern version of technology that we have, it's made up, maybe I'm sounding like a dinosaur, but it potentially made it harder for people to move through. And that's what I think I was really interested in getting some time with you, particularly today, was just to say, how are you handling those challenges? And the badge example is a great idea, but what other innovations do you kind of see that potentially can start to solve that disconnection? Disconnect's not a word, disconnect.
Disconnection, yeah. It's a really interesting point, because the greatest recruitment professionals that I've had the pleasure to work with in my career have been the ones who know the people who you wouldn't necessarily happen upon. And I guess that for me was what I was trying to recreate in the augmentation that we put on the search experience at Seek, was that serendipity, that challenge where you don't know the search term, but by digging into the history that we have based on your resume, perhaps we can surface something that you're like, oh, I would never have considered that, but now that you've opened my eyes to that, it's something that I'd like to dip into. And I think that that's something that the wealth of data that sits inside a recruitment platform, or a job board platform like Seek, it lends itself to. But you've got to have the confidence as a business, which Seek absolutely did and does, to bring in those slightly left field ideas, and also perhaps put in place a slightly longer runway. So I think that's one challenge that a lot of Australian businesses have when they look at using machine learning, or dare we say it, AI, within their business, is that they're not typical software product developments. There is a different cadence to building something out of data and really building a product that utilizes machine learning. And so I think that you have to be comfortable to take a slightly longer, and I'm not suggesting that people should go into caves and work on, challenging machine learning problems and never see the light of day. You should absolutely have an output focus. Yeah. But you do have a slightly different cadence. And I think that that's what Seek was quite forward-thinking in adopting, was the idea that they would need to run some perhaps more out there, more impactful opportunities that may or may not come to fruition and give them a little more time to incubate.
Yeah, great. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I say, it's something that I probably spend way too much time thinking about, but I guess that's what we do in our job. It's help people and companies connect. And as I say, there has to be, I believe, more efficient ways for both to find each other in some way in the future. And whatever vehicle that looks like, I don't know, but there has to be some mechanism. There must be a solution to kind of cut through it. I know as a recruiter, we can post an ad on Seek, and I can come in the morning and have 300 emails. And the reality is there's 300 people that have applied and not going to get the same quality of experience, because it's impossible as a human to give that attention to that volume of information. But it also feels somewhat wrong to leave that to a computer or a piece of software.
For me, I think that's where we should be building towards synergy, right? Because I agree with you that there are certain things that I don't think our society would be improved by having completely automated.
Yes.
But wouldn't it be wonderful if synergistically the recruitment professionals and the machine learning could work together to ensure that you could, in a timely fashion, give many more people closure?
Yeah.
Because people who are searching for roles, the thing you will hear most often is that they get ghosted all the time.
Exactly right. That's right.
And from when you understand the way the recruitment market works, you understand that for the recruiters, they get 300, 400, 1,000 applications for a role. I'm excited about how, even now, this far away as I am from that particular market, I'm still excited about how you can use machine learning and some of the newer techniques that are coming out around that to make it much easier for the recruiters to give feedback at scale, or even just to give closure at scale.
Yeah.
Because I think that would benefit everybody in the very multi-sided job search marketplace.
Yeah. Look, and my next question actually is related to that, and I'm definitely way from being anywhere close to an expert on this subject, but I did read an interesting paper, and it was talking about how, I guess in simple terms, machine learning is built on, or AI is built on replicating human behavior. And as humans, we're fundamentally biased. So therefore, the more that we lean into kind of AI, particularly around recruitment, are we actually just going to exacerbate bias because the machines will replicate the human behavior? As in, there's no human that isn't biased. So you can't say to a machine, replicate this behavior of this completely unbiased person. Again, I'd love to get your thoughts. You're going to know way more about this than myself, but I was just interested what your view is on that.
That's one reason why I find it super interesting when people are quite as confident as they are that generative AI is going to make quite as large a difference as they think it will. Because I think that it's quite easy, naively, for all of us to believe that I can get this machine to give me the answer. That is what I want. I want this all-knowing sci-fi-esque computer who I can ask any question under the sun and it can give me the answer. But it doesn't take very much thought to stop and say, that implies that there is one answer. And it's, again, not a very hard sort of mental leap to think of, well, that just isn't true, is it? Because if I was asking the question, and if you were asking the question, it's fairly unlikely that exactly the same answer would be the answer that you and I viewed as correct. And so I think that's where the conversation about bias begins.
Yeah.
Is that part of bias is simply that it's a very small subset of questions for which there is one exactly correct answer. And it's perhaps why I was drawn to mathematics and science, which is the subset of our world in which you're most likely to actually get precise, exact answers. The subject of bias in machine learning is enormous, and there is luckily really dedicated, research functions that really concentrate on understanding and elucidating bias. In recruitment, it was something that was always top of mind.
Yeah.
I am on record as having said, show me a fair world and I'll show you a fair algorithm. But the point being, I think that it behooves you to do everything you can to remove obvious sources of bias. And at some point, you have to realise that bias is baked into how we make decisions as humans.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are some really unpleasant cases of examples of companies who didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the training data that they were using to help those machines learn to recruit. And they did absolutely end up in exacerbating cultural stereotypes about who does what job.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to your point a couple of moments ago, which is it isn't obvious that this is a place where we should replace humans. So again, how do we work? And I think this is true across most of the fields where we would like to apply AI. How do we instead focus on creating really synergistic conditions for the humans and the machines to work together so we can let the machines do what they do well and bring the humans in to areas where that is still critically important?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it's something that probably within our business that we've discussed or talked about, which is we see AI as the opportunity for us to be more human.
Right.
And there could be aspects of our job that we can automate, which means we do get more human connection. We get more consultation time to speak to people about their careers and understand their desires or their challenges or their problems. And that could be a good thing. That could take us in some ways back 20 years to my box of cards when you invested in the relationships of the people that you wanted to help and were asking for help as well.
It's a really interesting point, and it was certainly something that was always top of mind for us at Xero, because we had more work than we could possibly handle in terms of where could you take machine learning inside a company which has 3 million small business owners and their advisors logging in and using your platform every day. And Xero and sort of the AI product strategy that I had there was very focused on, we have no interest in replacing bookkeepers or accountants.
Yeah.
We want to augment them. We want to do what machines do really well, to give the humans more opportunity and more scope and more time, quite frankly, to do what they do really well. So we would always focus in sort of two catchphrases that help the team really focus their attention. One was we want to remove toil and we want to delight with insight. So we want to find all those places where, for instance, reconciling your books.
Yeah.
No one really gets a huge thrill out of reconciling your books. If I can shave sub-seconds off every time you need to agree that this transaction should land in this place in your general ledger, what do you know? Bookkeepers and small business owners really, really enjoy that. Yeah. So I think that's a place where we really focused on the right problem. We focused on the problem of how do you free time from the humans so that they can go and then either run their business, because most small business owners, with the exception of bookkeepers obviously, don't go into small business to do their books. So where can I say, here, now you have time back to go back to your florist, to go back to your plumbing job, to go back to your consulting business. And from a bookkeeper or accountant's perspective, how can I take away some of that manual toil and give you the opportunity to actually become what most small business owners really, really need, which is a financial coach and a genuine advisor who has the information about the business at their fingertips through the augmentation of machines doing some of the more toilsome tasks, but can then take that human intuition and that much greater understanding of what it's actually like to operate in the real world and bring that financial coaching to bear. So that's where I see the massive opportunity for the application of AI in a way that will raise all boats, is not to attempt to replace people wholesale, but genuinely to look at a problem and say, how do we get the humans to do what they do really well and what they will continue to find an enjoyable job, and how do we augment them functionally and really, really well with machines? And it's not a trivial thing to do, as we are seeing in a lot of the research studies that come out of the application of AI in medicine. It's actually a genuinely difficult problem to figure out how to keep humans engaged, but augment them with machines in a really productive way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you're right, because a lot of the doomsayers out there are saying, our jobs are going to be replaced by robots, and it's a simplification, isn't it, of the reality. Whereas it's actually, as you say, about augmenting and improving quality of life and experience.
I notice when people say that the job will be replaced by a robot, it is almost always not their job that they're talking about. And I've really sort of chewed over this in my mind, because obviously it's something I get asked about a lot at the moment. And I think it's because we don't have a very good understanding of what the actual job is when it isn't a job that we do.
Yeah.
We understand our own job really well. So we tend to realise that there are places where the machines are not going to help. we just don't have a terribly good understanding of the real job of what someone else does. And I'll give you an example. A lot of people said, we're going to be able to replace copy editors. I don't know any copy editors who think that.
Yeah.
Because they actually know what their whole job entails, not what perhaps becomes the most iconic task within their job. And the rest of us are tending to zero in on that. I'm sure that must be the job.
Yeah.
And for instance, I've heard many board members suggest that, not so much now, but certainly a year ago, that generative AI was going to replace software engineers. I've never heard a software engineer who is in the slightest bit concerned about their job security, because the fallacy there is that software engineering majority involves writing code, which of course it doesn't.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think that gets attributed to Elon Musk, doesn't it? I think whether he said it or not, I don't know, but it gets attributed. He made a claim that software engineering will cease to exist within a decade or something to that effect. I'm going to reveal a secret, actually, which is that when we were working on this podcast, and Hayley, who's here with us today driving this, we wanted to come up with a name for the podcast. So we had a competition. So it was Hayley versus machine. So Hayley went away and came up with some names. And I sat and played around with ChatGPT and did some prompt engineering. And what was really interesting was that Hayley's name for the podcast was very similar to what ChatGPT was using. But we ended up with a hybrid. And it enabled us to actually play around with, well, that's interesting you came up with this. This is a kind of different way. And we put the two together, and that's how we ended up with the name for this podcast. Someone asked me this question yesterday, where did you come with the name? And I shared this story, which they thought was really interesting. But it's kind of what you're talking about. Actually, we still kind of used elements of the human, elements of the machine, and we put the two together to come up with something that we felt that really resonated with what we were doing. So it wasn't necessarily about replacing, and it's kind of copy writing to a certain degree what you just described, but it was augmenting and making things better. But Hayley's challenge was beat the machine, so she did. Where am I going to go next? I was going to ask you. I did actually read. I was going to ask you some more stuff about AI, but I think we've probably covered that off. I did read a recent post where you were comparing the journey of chocolate to data, and I'm never going to do this metaphor justice. So I just wondered if you could bring that to life.
Yeah, it was Easter, so forgive me.
Yeah.
And I was eating chocolate at the time.
Yeah.
One challenge that we're seeing discussed a lot, and here I am taking the conversation back to generative AI, but one challenge we're seeing discussed a lot at the moment is, who does the data belong to? Right? There's a really interesting philosophical and legal and human challenge around, is it okay that a lot of the firms that are currently potentially about to make an enormous amount of money with generative AI have not it's not clear that they've compensated the creators of that data. So that was where my mind was. And I know it's a really challenging subject for a lot of folk to come to grips with. I'm like, what do you mean by ownership of data? I don't quite get it. I don't quite understand it. And so for me, that was what the analogy was the ownership of chocolate is not in question. Perhaps it is if you're fighting over that last Easter egg at Easter. But, I purchase it. I am given the chocolate. I have the chocolate. And I think that I was trying to draw out the difference in data where replication of data is essentially zero cost. Now, okay, for those really technical people out there, don't jump on me. I understand that it's not entirely zero cost, but it's effectively zero cost, certainly a lot cheaper than replicating a bar of chocolate. And so it was an analogy to try to help folk understand that that's where some of the really peculiar subtleties come in this challenge of data ownership, is that I can have a copy, you can have a copy, everyone can have a copy if we go to Oprah on this. That doesn't mean that the rights to then build on top of that have gone with the physical thing. And I think one reason why we're getting ourselves tied up in knots a little bit around this concept is because it's different to the tangible world we live in every day. I do not have that problem when I'm discussing a bar of chocolate.
Yeah, great. Look, I read it, and it was on LinkedIn. You're right, it was at Easter, and it was a LinkedIn post, and it's with a picture of an Easter bunny. It caught my attention, and I read it, and I thought, I'm going to ask you, because I thought it would be great to bring that to life. I'm going to ask you a few sort of more broad career questions. I'm just curious, if you had your time over, would you have gone into tech sooner?
it's not really possible unless you mean would I have sacrificed the 11 years I had working in academia? Because I went straight from my academic training to working in technology, so there was no gap. So if the question is, do I regret spending 11 years at university? Never.
Do you still keep in touch with the physics side of things? Do you still read papers?
Physics papers, no.
Yeah.
I still keep an eye on quantum computing because that's what I spent my postdoc working on, was quantum computing and ion traps. So I'm always still super interested in where that field goes. I keep in touch with the people.
Yeah.
What I worked in was a very specific part of science. So no, I don't. I don't really keep in touch with that. But it's the experience, I think, that I would not trade for a million years. I mean, we were chatting before the podcast about the extraordinary history of Los Alamos and, the Manhattan Project, which everyone's become super familiar with in the last 6 months. But it's an amazing place. It's an amazing place to have the privilege to spend 12 months. MIT is an amazing place. Boston's an incredible city. Careers are long. I do not regret for an instant the 11 years I invested in understanding the breadth and fascination of the world of science. Yeah, and it serves me well to this day. One thing I think people sort of say was, well, you don't do physics anymore, so doesn't that feel like a waste? And you're like, I think you're underestimating how much the importance of scientific thinking, and particularly the formation of hypothesis, actually leads you to create value in a business career. I think we see a lot of people unwilling to take the time to form a belief that can then be proven or disproven.
Yeah.
And so we do see a lot of time and money wasted where folk haven't got crisp clarity around what it is they believe they can or cannot do. And so I think you tend to see programs of work run for a long time. I believe if we had more comfort with bringing science into the boardroom, which I think you do see a bit more in the US than we do in Australia, that we could perhaps gain from those methods of, cool, this is our hypothesis, we've actually clearly stated it, and therefore we can now go and say, oh, we were wrong, or happily, perhaps sometimes we were right. So no, not for a moment do I regret that time. It was both personally fabulous and really, really commercially valuable.
It's interesting, just what you're saying there. I met with someone recently who is head of engineering manager in a software company, and he actually trained as a doctor, did a medical degree. And he got to the end and thought, I don't want to be a doctor, and I enjoy code. And he said to me exactly the same thing. You know, what I learned through that around the hypothesis, testing, the science, the rigor, set me up great for a career in technology. And I just thought that's really insightful. It was really interesting the way he framed it. What are you most proud of in your career?
I'm proud of some of the products that I've built and deployed. I'm proud of that product that we deployed at Seek. I think it did valuable things for people, and probably does valuable things for people to this day. I'm super proud of some of the products that we deployed at Xero.
Yeah.
So the technical side of things, I love some of the products that we built. I'm also, maybe this shows, I think this does change as you get a little older and more mature in your career. I'm also really proud of the relationships I've built and the people that I've nurtured. And perhaps this is one of the advantages of getting older, is when people reach out and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know, this thing you did some time ago did this for me. I reflect on it in this way, and it changed the approach that I have to my career in this way. I'm really proud of that. I feel extremely privileged to have been in the position to be able to give people advice based on my career and based on sort of the learnings that I've had. And I've now had enough time to let that play out and see it come back as, you know what, Kendra, you actually told me this 3 years ago, or, you know, we had this conversation 5 years ago, and it caused me to do this, and this is what I learned from that. So I'm both feel really privileged to have been in that position, but super proud of those people whose careers I've supported and nurtured.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I think again, it's the human element that we just talked about. And I think it was interesting when you just answered the previous question about the physics, and you stay in touch with the people, but not the science. And it's interesting because when you look at your career, you do keep in touch with people that you build relationships with. I don't know, I'm still in touch with the people from the UK, but I very rarely say to them, how's the business going? Are you hitting targets, or are you doing this? But I want to know about them and their families and their lives and their careers and things that are going on with them.
I think the other super advantage, particularly when, like me, what your role has now become is building teams, that the people are what matters, right?
Yep.
Because much of the value I bring to a new business is the people I will bring in with me and the talent I can attract and the folk I can keep in the company.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of the more senior you become in your career, the more important that becomes. And I was chatting to a mentor of mine last summer, and he said it really becomes important, Kendra, who you know. And it was really interesting was what he didn't mean who you know as in to get you into a business, which is typically what you were told in a younger part of your career. What he meant was your value to a business will now also be hugely augmented by who you know and who you can therefore attract to come in and work with you on achieving the aims of the business.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that's another aspect as people develop as a leader and I think actually that's where something like LinkedIn is actually a very good platform for staying in connection with people, but also developing that personal brand and finding like-minded people as well, because otherwise you're kind of very much within your four walls. But I think getting out of that, and I think it's a kind of virtual playground, so to speak, for that aspect of the career. I'm interested to talk to you about feedback. What's the most significant feedback you've received in your career?
That is a really challenging question to answer, because I think it's sort of like asking what's the one killer use case for machine learning. There's very rarely one killer use case for machine learning. The value lies in the many, many, many bricks in the wall that you can build and the things that you can build on top of it. So there's no one most important piece of feedback, but there's three I'll bring up because I think they could be useful for other folk. One was really early on, actually, back in my career as a leader at Datacom, when my boss at the time, she's a lovely lady, she said to me, Kendra, you wear your heart on your sleeve. And there's good parts of that, but the bad part of it is you walk on the floor and everybody knows how you're feeling.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she was right. And it's stuck in my head, and we're talking 18 years ago now, it's stuck in my head. And I think it's that comfort with yourself and the maturity with yourself, but it's also the ability to pause and consciously be able to put emotion in a box and bring a calm demeanor, because the more people who look to you within a company, the more impact your being out of sorts will have, the more impact your being clearly uncomfortable with a decision or a market condition will have. And so I think that was really, really insightful of her to tell me, and it has been valuable for me to reflect on over almost 2 decades now of we're all told to bring your whole self to work, which I completely agree with, although it's really challenging to do, particularly as a woman working in technology sometimes. But that's not the same as broadcasting your whole self at work the entire time. So super valuable feedback. Another thing a really recent boss of mine said to me was, I must have been having a slightly bad day, and he said, Kendra, if I'm trying to get the exact wording because it was such a lovely piece of advice, but it was effectively it was, if the choice is between conspiracy and incompetence, perhaps assume incompetence.
Right.
And why I think that was a lovely piece of feedback was, I mean, he knew how to couch that in terms that he knew I was going to remember, but it was also that very few people, I would perhaps rephrase it now, as very few people get out of bed in the morning trying to do a bad job. We all work within a really, really complex environment, and it is super easy to do things that are suboptimal in some ways because they're optimal in other ways. So that challenge of trying to optimize holistically is really, really hard. And so I think it's just a great way to look at it. It's like, you know what? Often when it looks like somebody is doing something that is genuinely just counterproductive, it's more likely that it's optimized for an outcome that is more important to their space inside the business than perhaps to yours.
Yeah, that's great advice.
There's That was two. There was a third piece, but it got out of my head. So
that's okay. I'll let you off the hook. I also, from my research, discovered that you and I have a shared passion, which is radical candor. I read Kim Scott last year, and I spoke to my coach, and I said, I'm trying to read this book. What I meant by that was it's a big concept. It's a philosophy, in my opinion, radical candor. It's a way of kind of being. It's not, you read Start With Why, and it's a singular concept of what you can kind of put in place, whereas radical candor is a much more holistic way of kind of leading a business. I was just interested, how did you discover Kim Scott? And what is it meant to you?
You've stolen one of my book recommendations, Anton. So I'm not what I'm going to do now. But you have introduced to the audience one of my absolutely favourite leadership books of all time. So I cannot remember how I first stumbled across it, but I'm blessed that I did. It's a book that I reread every 3 to 4 years, and I really recommend that people do. I think that if there's one challenge with the Book of Radical Candor, it's that people particularly who haven't read it, think about it as the book about radical candor.
Yep.
But it is actually so much more than that. If you have not read it, do yourself a favour, go out and buy it and read it. The two things that I would really like people to sort of maybe try and give you just that one step beyond radical candor. One is, and I think that Kim does an amazing job of outlining this in the book, but it's often overlooked when people are talking about the book. She talks a lot about how you create an environment in which a style of leadership, which is about being radically candid, actually works. And I've seen a lot of companies try to superficially think about, we should be radically candid. It's like, you haven't read it, have you?
Yeah.
Because you can't go from, I've just met you, to a situation in which the sort of really constructive and strong and personal feedback that she is talking about will work. Because the first thing you have to do is build a relationship of mutual respect.
Yep.
So I think that that's actually why one of the things that has made Radical Candor so valuable to me as a book is that it has given me a true confidence that my personal leaning, I guess, which is towards relationship-based leadership and investing in creating relationships, it helped me understand why I believe that is so important and why am I prepared to invest so much time in it. Because I know that I listen to feedback far more receptively if I have a genuine mutual respect with the person I'm having that conversation with, because then I am really super confident that they are giving me that feedback because they know I can be a stronger person and a better leader and a more, happier individual if I can make an adaptation to my style. And I'm able to listen to it with the belief that they totally value me and they reckon I could be even better if X. And I think so many of us believe that just giving radical candor is just all about, you should toughen up and take it. And it's nothing to do with that. And I think that's where the book gets overlooked. The other concept I just love to pieces, and folk who have listened to me on podcasts before we roll in their eyes, but it is the concept that she introduces partway through the book about rock stars and superstars. And please go and read it. I'm not going to do justice to what she talks about, but the concept underlying it is one that I think a lot of people leaders miss, and particularly younger people leaders. People aren't rock stars or superstars. People are in a rock star phase or a superstar phase. And I remember giving some advice to a leader of mine, a leader of people who worked for me some years ago, an individual in the team that we were talking about who had really strong personal responsibilities outside of work at that time. And, the leader I was listening to was sort of saying, I don't think I'll approach that person because, and I'm like, hang on. That's not a reason not to approach them. It's a great reason to believe that there might be a reason that they say no thank you if you really get into that conversation, but it's not a reason not to approach them. And fantastically, the person really took that on board and that conversation played out, and in actual fact the individual was super keen and wanted to step into that space and really did have the mind share to take that space. And I think that to me, the reason that I was primed to give that advice in that conversation that we were having was that whole conversation around people go through phases.
Yeah.
And you should never label somebody as being unambitious or being ambitious. One reason why I've really struggled with 9 boxes,
Yeah.
the leadership concept where you've got your high achievers and you put them up in this. Like, high achievers when? High achievers how? Everyone, careers are long and people are on phases through that journey of how much time they want to bring to work.
Yeah.
Kim's got a wonderful example in the book. I just think it's just one of those ones that really sticks in your mind. So I think it's a really useful one. She talks about some folk who worked with her who were both Olympic class athletes.
Yes.
So for sure, at that time, they were not ambitious at work because they were phenomenally focused on competing in the Olympics. And guess what? When the Olympics had passed, their phase at work changed and they became extraordinarily rapid growth, career-focused individuals for a period of time.
Yeah.
So that's the other aspect of Kim Scott's book I really like that I think gets overlooked a lot because it's not in the title.
Yes.
Is people go through phases, don't put people in boxes.
Do you know what? I think what you've just articulated, by the way, is exactly why I was trying, like, to describe myself as trying to read it, as in there was so much to absorb, so much to think about. And I found myself just drifting off thinking, how can we make this work and how can we articulate and how do we get it? And we ended up spending probably the last 6-9 months rolling it out through the business and having career conversations and talking about feedback and the leadership team asking for feedback and responding to that and really just starting to get to understand people. And we're still working at it. You know, it's still something that we believe that is going to make a difference in our culture. But yeah, it's interesting. When I saw that, like, was researching, you came up, I was like, I'm definitely going to ask you about this. I'm sure you're across this, but there's the follow-up books coming out soon, Radical Respect, I think it's called. So I'm very interested to see what comes through for that. I do have a secret ambition, which is to try and get Kim to come on to Tales from Tech Titans. So that's on our bucket list to see if we can do that. But
I did have a little bit of a fangirl conversation with a CEO of a New Zealand startup who has actually met Kim.
Yep.
And I was like, we'll talk about what you want to talk about, which was the use of generative AI within their business. But I'm like, but then you have to tell me what Kim's like. So.
Yeah. Do you know, there's a really cool company in New South Wales called Mintable. Mm-hmm. They've just launched a product called Tandem, and it's for giving feedback. And they're both ex-Gusto from Silicon Valley. Somehow they're from that part of the world, but they're now in New South Wales. They're backed by Blackbird Ventures, an Australian VC, and Flying Fox as well, I think. But yeah, I was catching up with Mel, and she actually did say before she had a coffee with Kim Scott, and I was like, can you say, I'd love to put a quote on the back of the book, but I'm sure I wouldn't qualify. But it's amazing. The final question, kind of career question: what singular piece of sage advice would you give to the next generation?
I think it would be, and I keep coming back to this like a broken record, but your career, if you're lucky, and the world is lucky, will probably be 50 years, 60 years. And this touches on my book recommendation, which we may or may not get to. But maybe you leave formal education for the first time at 20, and realistically now, as our lifespans expand and our ability to support folk in retirement perhaps contracts, you'll likely be working for 50 or 60 years. So careers are long. I think it's really easy when you're young to get focused on the next step in my career is absolutely critically important and it'll make it or break it. And it just isn't. Mm. So I think 2 things I would suggest. One is to try to at least think a few steps ahead. So if I were to do this, what would I then perhaps do? So sort of think of it as a ever branching tree where one opportunity opens you up to more opportunities. And the other one I vehemently believe from personal experience and from other folks' experience is nothing you learn is ever wasted. So I've certainly seen this in young consultants just getting terribly antsy about this one assignment that they're stuck on that they really feel is not advancing their career. I'm like, I think you're thinking about your career a little too linearly. Mm. Because if you do something that is boring, if you work for somebody who is an appallingly poor people leader, you can take learnings from that. Maybe those learnings are, I want to automate this away so that no one ever has to do it again in their lives. Or when I am leading people, there are particular traits and particular ways of engaging in conversation that I know I will always steer clear of because of how unproductive that is. But you can always learn things. And so I think that having a growth mindset and a really expansive mindset about the task that I'm doing today may not feel particularly enriching, but what are the frameworks and the experiences that I can build around that and draw from that? You add them to your mental toolbox and you add them to your kit of how you would approach problems. So that would be the advice I would give is, if you think that what you're learning is pointless, you are not thinking about it the right way. Try to come back to that experience and figure out how you might augment it and take learnings from it.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm going to ask book recommendations. I've taken one off the table, so you may need to freestyle for me now. But what's your recommendation or recommendations?
So I'm going to put a plug in for Radical Candor. Go read it, buy it, give it to your team. But another book that I have just found really transformational, I'll stick to career books perhaps, is a book called The 100-Year Life. And that is by a lady called Linda Grattan, I think, and someone whose name is also Scott, I believe, just to be confusing, although I think it might be Michael Scott. But it's a book that is actually why I brought up that example about the career being really long. They talk about that fact that a lot of the practices for how we think about careers are actually based on what we saw our parents do and our grandparents do. And what did they do? They left formal education if they were lucky enough to get the chance to do that. They worked often in one company or only a couple of companies, and they retired, often at 60. They only worked for 40 years. We are now much more likely to work for 70 years, and the concept of working for one company and that company taking care of you throughout your career is largely a forgotten, era of bygone history. What they are suggesting to you is that as your lifespan elongates, which ours are, our children, born in the early 2000s, are likely to live to 100. They have a 50-50 chance of living to 100. No one's going to be retiring at 60. You're going to be starting to think about retiring at 75 or at 80. And the idea inside 100-Year Life, which I think is amazing, is the idea of having multiple careers and moving from a situation where we expect education, employment, retirement, into one where we expect education, employment, education, employment, education, employment. And it's a fantastic book, one to read on a summer holiday. Absolutely. And really be able to get into the implications behind it and then take that back into how you evolve the rest of your career.
It's interesting. As you're saying that, I was thinking, I've read somewhere, maybe correct, maybe not correct, but that the origins of the word occupation comes from the Industrial Revolution, and it's when people first started leaving home to go to work, and it's how we occupied ourselves. And I think about this a lot, what you're just describing there. How are we going to occupy ourselves for 100 years? It doesn't just mean going to a place of work in a traditional 9-to-5 job and drawing a salary and kind of coming home. There's many ways to occupy ourselves. And if you kind of follow the stuff around the Ikigai, or I think I'm pronouncing that right, it's that kind of sense of there's no retirement. You just have different phases of life, which is probably similar to Kim Scott example as well, but there's different phases of life where you're doing different things. And that's the kind of secret to kind of enriching life and experience. So that's a great recommendation. Thank you. I was going to ask for a sci-fi recommendation because I did read that you were a sci-fi fan as a girl.
My go-to sci-fi recommendation is probably still Douglas Adams.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Classic.
Yeah, it really is. And the radio tapes, not the books, right?
Okay.
The radio tapes.
There you go. Proper old school.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been so insightful today. I feel like we've learned loads from you and your experiences, and I think it's going to be really, really valuable for a lot of people. So thank you.
Oh, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Tech Titans, and be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast. If you'd like to get more insights about tech careers, then check out the Emmbr, that's EMMBR LinkedIn page for the latest updates, articles, and engaging discussions.